South African Union of Students wishes the 2023 matric class well on their achievements. But then again, the union is expressing concern about the state of readiness for institutions of higher learning. Its worry is particularly around placing of first-year students and accommodation for all qualifying students. For more on this conversation, we're now joined by Asive Dlanjwa, who speaks for the South African Union of Students. Asive, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening.
Good evening, sis, and also good evening to your viewers and your listeners. Thank you for having us.
It's an absolute pleasure. Asive, how do you assess the overall readiness in terms of the support for the first years that should be now getting into the next phase of their lives, being tertiary?
So there are a few things. The first one, obviously, is the availability of space and the ability of the higher education sector to be able to absorb those that are coming from basic education, which I suppose we'll touch on those numbers. So that would be the first thing. The second thing would be the means for them to be able to get into higher education. So this includes, but not necessarily limited to issues of funding, the availability of funding, which for the majority of South Africans, that has been NSFAS. So that then also speaks to the stability and the ability of NSFAS to be able to carry out its mandate in terms of servicing those which are the poor and the working class. And then I suppose the third aspect would just be the administrative issues in terms of the institutions, in terms of their registration. For instance, a majority of them have registration fees, which some of them can go up to 15,000 rands per student. All the administration. So basically looking at more or less about those three things, and if you're able to really get through those three things the best possible way, then relatively a state of readiness to be able to begin the year, we would be ready for us to be able to begin the academic year.
So in terms of your worry with regards to, maybe let's look at the first leg being access, as you mentioned, out of the three. How many matriculants passed this year, and how many can be accommodated in these tertiary institutions? All right.
So you're looking at, for instance, just in this year alone, you're looking at just about 280,000 students that would have passed with a bachelor pass. But you also have about 180,000, almost 190,000 with diplomas, which would also still be applying at universities. Now, so you're more or less looking at almost about 400,000 students that are qualified to get in. And spaces, you're looking at just under 200,000 spaces. But this is just for this year. So this is notwithstanding the backlog from the previous year. So you're more or less left with another 60% of candidates who could have gotten in, but there was not space from the previous year. So cumulatively, in any given year, you sit, for instance, in a particular, when you look at all the institutions, you'll be sitting with more or less about 700 to 900,000 applications for those 200,000 spaces, or less than 200,000 spaces. So that's what we're looking at in terms of numbers. So there's definitely an incapacity in terms of higher education to be able to absorb, not only in universities, including colleges, because I mean the capacity of universities is 1 million students, about 1.1 million students, and the TVET sector about 600,000. So you're looking at about 1.6, 1.7 million students, or rather capacity, and each year you're matriculating almost 800,000 matriculants, you understand? So it's a crisis, it's a definite crisis in terms of that capacity.
So as the South African Union of Students, what interventions have you made? Have you met with any of the stakeholders to see how this year could be dealt with differently?
You see, there are some issues that are structural in nature, like what I'm telling you now, and there's no amount of meetings or intervention really that will make a serious dent in terms of being able to turn the tide on the structural challenges. But what we try to do is that for those that are able to get in, a few things is that, firstly, let's be able to get in the poor and the working class to be able to study. We believe that they should be prioritized for the same reason, for the fact that they come from poor backgrounds, and we believe that's one of the few opportunities that they have to be able to pull themselves from the clutches of poverty. So the first thing that we look into is ensuring that in terms of the admission policies of institutions, we are able to cater and create some sort of a conducive environment for the poor and the working class to be able to get in. Secondly, would also to be negotiating with universities. Let me give you a practical example. Right now, we're currently negotiating with the department, probably doing that irritated, because what you are currently having is that registrations are have begun in almost all universities. And yet NSFAS results or outcomes of funding have not come out. They are likely not to come out until the end of this month, except for SASSA beneficiaries, which get an automatic funding decision. Now that says that those that can afford will now be able to pay into these institutions, while the poor and the working class will be waiting in some sort of a purgatory, waiting for the eventual answer from NSFAS. So those are things that we try to deal with to ensure that within the constraints of the spaces that we have and the funding challenges that we have, let us be able to, one, give priority to the poor and the working class, number two, to ensure that those processes run as smooth as possible. Another example would be that we've got universities that are charging students, as I've said, some of them up to 15,000 rands that they have to pay up front before they can study. So these are some of the things that we try to deal with to ensure that within those constraints we are able to get the most effective registration and admission process as far as possible.
And in your discussions, especially with the Department of Higher Education and with regards to NSFAS funds only being released later on in the month, what are the reasonings that you're getting from them? Because surely by now, already the results of the matriculants have come out so late in terms of registrations, have already started in many tertiary institutions. What reasons are you getting from NSFAS also as well with regards to this delay and how it then impacts on those post-students that you make reference of?
It's incompetence and lack of leadership. There's nothing else. Because, for instance, you will remember, look, you've got basic education as a stakeholder, you've got universities as a stakeholder, and then you've got NSFAS as a stakeholder. NSFAS and the universities are all under the tutelage of the Ministry of the Department of Higher Education, and obviously the department under basic education, but these are all government entities. So, for instance, you've got basic education. Up until COVID, the results were coming out in the first week of January, and now they've gone to the second week of January, which is absolutely unacceptable. Now, these are things that can be dealt with that are not being dealt with. Another thing that we have said to the department, because the department is largely responsible for this, is that you've got to have a coherence and ensure that your systems at NSFAS are congruent to that of universities. You've got two options. The first one, because these are public institutions under your guidance and leadership, ensure that their registration dates are in line with your readiness to be able to release results. Alternatively, you bring your adjudication processes to the level of those results. So really, some of the issues that we are dealing with are issues of incompetence and lack of leadership, really, because the money is there, for instance. Like last year during the money was there. It's just an issue of being able to coordinate the sector to the most optimal level to ensure that the sector is smooth, is operating, the best that it can. And obviously, there are issues of corruption, malfeasance, and which are riddling some of these institutions, which often undermine the capacity of these institutions to be able to perform at the level at which they should be.
Speaking of NSFAS, I mean, they've had their fair share of challenges in the last couple of months, the most recent being the allowances of 2023 that are still not yet being paid. They've now said the blame is on the universities for not supplying the relevant data on time. How much of an intervention do you believe the Department of Higher Education and Training has done in this particular instance?
I think we must start firstly by saying that we must protect NSFAS at all costs. I think that because sometimes there's a miscommunication and misunderstanding that the fight to root out some of these things which I'll speak about is tantamount to fighting or getting rid of the scheme. We've seen also some bogus institutions, some even here on Newzroom, saying that NSFAS must be scrapped, which is absolute nonsense, because when there are hundreds and thousands of students and families that have benefited directly from NSFAS. So the first thing is that our priority is to protect the scheme, the integrity of the scheme, and its ability to service the poor and the working class, number one. So number two, so there are issues of corruption at NSFAS, there are issues of incompetence, and as I've said before, all under the leadership or the department should be playing a role in dealing with some of these issues. So we just think decisive action must be taken in terms of dealing with some of these issues. We've been on this platform quite a few times. We've spoken on some of the measures which we think should be taken, and it's not impossible to deal with some of these issues. I think think more than anything, what we are sitting with is a lack of leadership at a political level in terms of the department, but also at the level of NSFAS. I mean, right now we are sitting with a compromised acting CEO who was found by an independent report to have adjudicated and chaired the illegal appointment of service providers to the tune of almost 1 billion rand a month, and that person is at the helm of the scheme. So you begin to wonder, what chances does the scheme have to be able to carry out its mandate towards the point of working? So it's just having to deal with those things while at the same time trying to protect the integrity and the capacity and the capability of the scheme.
And as SAUS, what do you believe needs to happen in the immediate future, especially when it comes to NSFAS, for the students that would be applying for this year?
Look, we firstly, in terms of the governance of NSFAS, there has been changes there. The chair has stepped down and an acting chair has been brought in. We're hoping that will bring about some stability. The CEO needs to go at NSFAS. We called a few months ago for the removal and the replacement of the IT executive, which were also messing the system up. That was done. There seems to be some turnaround there. So those are some of the things that can be done at a practical level and an operational level. The results need to be taken out as soon as possible, because unless you take out the results as soon as possible, by the time you take those results out, as we've seen in the previous years, what is a guarantee is that the poor and the working class will be standing outside the institutions, their spaces will be taken. So those results need to be taken out as soon as possible. Some things are medium and to long term, which we'll be dealing with throughout the year. Issues of competency at NSFAS. We have identified departments and weak areas and soft spots where we think we can bolster to be able to bring in competent people to strengthen the capacity of the scheme. But in the immediate governance, there needs to be a strengthening there, as we have seen. At the level of the executive is just there's no one there in that office, and then obviously then those results must be taken out as soon as possible.
Quickly and lastly, Asive, the Cabinet has approved 2 more universities. How confident are you in those universities being up and running as soon as possible to take in this missing middle of students that don't have space?
Look, we are hoping and appealing to the department and in fact to government that they will prioritize the building of those institutions outside what are budgetary concerns. The reason we are saying that is because this is an investment into the human capital of the country. Whatever chances we have of getting out of the economic conditions we find ourselves in and building a strong economy and a strong country is based on our ability to be able to invest in education, skills and research. So we are hoping that government, over and above the constraints, that they will speed up the building of those 2 universities. We need them. And fortunately, actually, those 2 universities are entrenched in the STEM, in the science, technology and mathematics fields. So, and that is the type of critical skills that we need to be able to drive the growth in the country. So we are hoping that over and above that, they will invest in that no matter what.
Asive, thank you so much for your time. It's always appreciated having you on the channel. Thank you.